We're coming to the time in our service now where we're going to look at a passage of Scripture, and we'll talk about what it means for us now, today, and how it matters. We're continuing for 2 more weeks now in the book of Exodus. I know you thought it was ending last week, but it's still going on. And we're going to pick it up this morning in Exodus chapter 12, starting at verse 43. If you're using a Brown Pew Bible, it'll be on page 48. If you could find that passage, and when you found it, would you stand with me, and we'll read through our passage this morning together. Exodus chapter 12, beginning at verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the regulations for the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it. Any slave you have bought may eat of it after you've circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it. It must be eaten inside one house. Take none of the meat outside of the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part, like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it. The same law applies to the native-born and to the alien living among you." All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. Chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal." Then Moses said to the people, "Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today, in the month of Abib, you are leaving, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land he swore to your forefathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey. You are to observe this ceremony in this month. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, and on the 7th day hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. With nothing with yeast is to be seen among you, nor shall yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance in the appointed time year after year. The Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you as he promised on oath to you and your forefathers. You are to give over to the Lord the firstborn offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In the days to come, when your son asks you, what does this mean? Say to him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in Egypt, both man and animal. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the firstborn male of offspring of every womb, and redeem each of my firstborn sons. And it will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord has brought us out of the land of Egypt with his mighty hand." This is God's word. You may be seated. Let me pray for us quickly to begin this time. God, we come now to your word with open and expectant hearts. Speak to us what you want to reveal to us. Encourage us where we need to be encouraged. Convict us where we need to be convicted. Accomplish what you seek to accomplish in each heart that you brought here this morning. And I ask, as always, eternal God, move and govern my tongue now to speak your truth. Amen. Well, I want to talk with you this morning about the importance of remembering. Remembering. It's been said by far too many people even to list, so I'm not even going to go there, but we've all heard it said something like this, that those who fail to remember the past are doomed to repeat it. Have you heard this? Something like it? And the implication there, of course, is that no matter how significant an event, as finite human beings, we are prone to forget lessons that we've already learned in the past from experiences. So, study of history, setting up holidays, memorials, all these things are often necessary to keep those lessons in front of us so that we don't make the same errors again. Now, that axiom about not forgetting the past is often used in connection or reference to negative events that we don't want to see repeated. I mean, many of you have seen posters or bumper stickers in reference to the terrorist attacks of September 11th with the sign that says, "Never forget." We set up Holocaust museums and memorials in order to remind us about the atrocities committed in Nazi Germany or in Rwanda or these places. Each year on November 11th at 11 a.m., we take time to stop and remember the sacrifices of those who died in wars to secure our freedom. The purpose or intention of those holidays, those memorials, along with just reminding us not to make those mistakes again, it also has a future purpose as well. We are taught and instructed really by remembering in a way that helps us. When we remember the past, it helps inform then the way we are now to live our lives going ahead. Well, the exact same thing is going to be seen in our passage this morning, where God sets up these memorials for His people. Last Sunday, we looked at really the climactic pinnacle events in Israel's history of the Passover, that final decisive moment where God brought that plague of death on the land of Egypt, and His people were delivered out of that plague by the sacrifice of a lamb. God now wants to set up these perpetual reminders of that Passover event in order to make sure that His people never forget what happened on that day, how they were saved and what they were saved from. That's all going to inform now how they live their lives going forward. Now, I don't know, maybe that seems strange to you. Why would God even bother to do something like that? Is He just helping them to continue to celebrate these great events of their salvation? I mean, surely God doesn't think that people of Israel could ever forget such an epic, amazing, transforming event of deliverance, right? Well, if you've read ahead in the story at all, you know that, well, God knows that forgetting the Passover, forgetting this incredible moment of deliverance is exactly what His people are going to do over and over again. So He wants to set up these reminders to help them not do that. And as incomprehensible as that might be for us, that they could forget something like that, if we're honest with ourselves, I think we need to say we're probably no better at remembering, are we? We're probably no better than remembering in our own lives. And as much as that's true, that's hard for us to admit. I mean, even people that know we don't have good memories, we still believe we remember pretty good. Don't we? We get mad at people, indignant, when they suggest that we might forget something. Of course, Mom, I remember to bring a change of underwear for every day at Quanos. Of course I'll remember to pick up the kids. Of course I remember that today's our wedding anniversary. Like, whatever it is, even with evidence after evidence that we do forget things, we pridefully resist these reminders as though our very worth as human beings was being impugned. How dare you suggest that I don't have a perfect memory? Now, please help me find my car keys. You know, it's literally in the same breath sometimes. So the reason why this passage is so important, so relevant for us today is because just like the people of Israel, freshly released from the land of slavery in Egypt, the reality is for us, whether it's from tiredness and fatigue, a carelessness, whatever it is, we forget things. We forget even really important things, and we do it all the time. We just do. When it comes to the most important event in our lives, our salvation, even with the best of intentions, we need intentional, meaningful ways of remembering what's been accomplished for us in the gospel. Because we can be in danger ourselves of forgetting even that. And then actually weakening the gospel's power to continue to transform us. Now, no, of course, the gospel itself never loses its power to transform. But in forgetting it, we absolutely can fail to appropriate its power to continue to transform us. Just as a medication is effective for treating an illness, but if we forget to take it, the power is no longer useful to us. Because you see, one of the things you begin to see when you come to faith in Jesus is that although God's power and the gospel does transform us from dead to alive, from slave to free, one of the things the gospel doesn't do is transform us from newborn babies to fully mature adults. Right? And while salvation is a one-time act of God that He alone accomplishes, growing in godliness, continuing to be transformed, what the Bible calls sanctification, that's a lifelong activity that we partner with God in order to accomplish. In fact, it's us partnering with God that probably makes it take so long. And so setting up these intentional ways of remembering then, it helps us to be warned against returning to what we've left, and also encourages us now in the future to obedience. And we think about the cost of what it costs to redeem us. That's how remembering this way continues to transform us. And in order to see how God helps His people always remember this moment of redemption in their lives and how that can encourage us to do the same, I want to look at three helps, three memorials that God gives to His people this morning in our passage. We're going to see that God gives His people a meal of remembrance, a sacrifice of remembrance, and then finally, a community of remembrance. A meal, a sacrifice, and a community of remembrance. So if you have closed your Bibles, I encourage you to open them back up to Exodus 12. Follow along with me, and we'll see how He does this together. So let's begin by looking at a meal of remembrance. A meal of remembrance. If you look at verse 43, right at the beginning of our passage, we see God's setting up now. I'm giving you the regulations, the instructions through Moses and Aaron for this Passover meal that they're to now yearly celebrate in remembrance. Much of verses 43 to 50 actually have to do with who's allowed to eat the meal at all. But if you look at verse 46 in particular, we see some very specific instructions about how this meal is to be eaten. Look there with me. He says, verse 46, this meal must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. Now, this isn't because God is particularly anti-barbecue or He doesn't like campfire cookouts. Remember, the whole purpose of the Passover meal was that once the lamb was sacrificed and the blood was put on the doorposts of the home, that home was then now covered under the protection of the blood that signified this home had been obedient to God's command, and the plague of death would pass over them. So that's why if they were to take the meal outside, if they were to go outside of the home or eat it out there, they would no longer be covered under the protection. Interesting, too, as I saw this week studying here, that most scholars agree that one part about don't break any of the bones actually has no immediate significance at all to the Passover, other than one more time now pointing ahead to how Jesus is our true and better Passover lamb. Because in Psalm 34:20, the psalmist there talks about God's protection of His righteous one, and one of the ways He says He protects him is that none of his bones will be broken. In the New Testament, if you remember, when Jesus is being crucified on the cross, the two criminals on either side of Him, their legs are broken in order to expedite their deaths. When they come to Jesus, they see He's already dead, and so they don't break His legs. They pierce His side instead. John tells us in John 19:36, these things happened so that the Scriptures will be fulfilled. Not one of His bones will be broken. And they also say they will look on the one whom they have pierced. It's a very particular stipulation that doesn't have significance here, but certainly points ahead to Jesus. If you look now in chapter 13, verses 3 through 10 here, they're giving the instructions for this addition to the Passover meal, that feast of unleavened bread we talked about, where they added on in order to celebrate a week-long celebration of God's delivering event here. Verse 3 tells us, if you look with me, that they are to commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand. So this is talking all about how they are to celebrate this deliverance of God, and they're to do it through a meal of remembrance. A meal of remembrance that's pointing back to the Passover. Look at verses 6 through 7 with me. God says here, for 7 days eat bread made without yeast. On the seventh day hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, or anything with yeast shall be seen anywhere within your borders. So He's setting up this meal, and this is those same instructions that we actually saw last week about that feast of unleavened bread, the yeast to be cleared out of the homes as a way of signifying their readiness to leave, right? So, maybe a lot of this just seems like review. I mean, it's like just repeating the same stuff. Why is God just going over this same stuff again? Isn't that what He already said now talking about remembering, I think we'd all agree that repetition never hurts when it comes to remembering things. But in particular, one of the things I just want to point out this morning is that God is giving these instructions for the people of how they're to celebrate the meal, not just this time, but going forward, afterwards. He's showing them how they are to continue to celebrate this meal going forward. Look at verse 5 with me. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and his other ites, the land that he swore to your forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. Okay, so he's saying, when you've been freed from slavery, when you're settled into the land that God promised you, that your forefathers, and you're all settled in, when you have all the time in the world to roast a lamb out in the barbecue or to let your bread rise, to do all those things, it's then that I want you to remember the Passover in this way. Why? Because that's the very time that you're most likely to forget what happened here today. When the pressure's off, you're no longer looking over your shoulder anymore, that's when you're going to need the most help remembering how I delivered you today. You know, it's like after you buy a new home and you start to get all settled in, once everything's put away, and then all of a sudden, that's the time when you start to forget, you're most likely to forget what it was like before. When you were living in that one-bedroom basement suite with 6.5-foot ceilings and like one little south-facing window, and you were cooking your meals on a turned upside-down clothing iron, you forget. It's so easy to forget in that moment. You'd say something. You could say something in that moment like, oh, I hate this house. How could all 5 of the bathrooms be being used right now? So easily forget. So in order to keep God's people from forgetting all that they've been rescued from and who it is that rescued them, God sets up this meal of remembrance that they're to keep each and every year. And as we talked about last week, in the New Testament, just before Jesus went to the cross, he's celebrating that very Passover meal that Moses commands his people to eat yearly right at that moment. But you remember we said Jesus actually, in taking that meal, he redefines the whole significance of the meal. He says, yes, continue to celebrate this Passover meal, but from now on, it's never going to be about remembering God delivering people out of Egypt. It's going to be remembering me now. Now, celebrating this Passover will be celebrating what I'm about to do in freeing you from your sin and death and slavery. And like all Christian churches around the world, we continue to celebrate that very meal that Jesus commanded us to eat in remembrance of him today. In fact, in our church, we've chosen to celebrate this meal every single Sunday because we want to make the most use, really. One of the reasons is to make the most use of this means that God gives us to continue to point us back to the gospel. Continually point us back to the cost of what our redemption cost God in order to accomplish. And in doing this, we continue to protect our hearts and minds from forgetting. When we leave this place with all of our senses still tingling from the taking of this meal of remembrance, it protects our hearts from forgetting the gospel. And so, we continue to be transformed by it. So that's a meal of remembrance. Next, let's look at a sacrifice of remembrance. A sacrifice of remembrance. We see this, first of all, in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13. Look with me there. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal." Now, we've talked a great deal throughout this series about the significance of the firstborn son in this time and culture. We see now God's telling the people they're to consecrate all of the firstborn males of both people and animal to God. Now, to consecrate something simply means to set it apart for holy use, or even to offer up to God and make it holy by doing so. If you look ahead to verses 11 through 13 of chapter 13 here, you can see how God talks about how they are to carry out this sacrifice of remembrance. Look here with me quickly. Verse 11, "After the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to your forefathers, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons." So first of all, again, verse 11, he's still giving that future direction. He's saying into the future, when you're free, when you're most likely to forget this event, remember this way. This is going to point you back always to what happened here today when you remember with the sacrifice of remembrance. Verse 12 talks about how they're to sacrifice to him all the firstborn of their livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, etc. But look at verse 13. All of a sudden, there's a change, a slight change. All of a sudden, God talks about redeeming. Redeem with the lamb firstborn donkeys. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In his commentary on this passage, Philip Ryken talks about redeeming and what it means. He says redeeming something is really to buy it back by paying a price. When we redeem something, we buy it back by paying a price, which actually makes it a lot like paying a ransom. Both of those terms, actually, redeem and ransom, are used consistently throughout the Bible to represent God's saving of us, God's saving of his people. So, all of a sudden, there's this new concept, and without going into this huge description of a sacrificial system for the Jews, I just want to simply say, of all the sacrifices that God prescribed for his people, there were two types of sacrifices that weren't acceptable to him. Two types that weren't acceptable. One was child sacrifice, and one was unclean animals. Unclean animals, of which a donkey was considered a part. So, God prescribes a way now that the people can offer or sacrifice the firstborn back to God without killing them, because they can't offer those things to him. Now there's a way, he says, they can be sacrificed or offered to him by redeeming them, by buying them back by sacrificing a lamb instead. Now, interesting to see, I don't know if you picked this up, but you notice it's the same price for a donkey as it is for a baby. Now, that's either saying a lot for a donkey or not very much for babies. So what's going on there? Why would God equate the two things that way? Well, all that's being communicated is how unclean things are redeemed. How unclean things are redeemed. It's the same cost. What God's communicating is mankind. All of mankind, from the first sin of Adam going forward now, is ceremonially unclean before God. All of us come in need of redemption. And the death of a lamb will be necessary in order to pay for that redemption. It's all pointing ahead. So it's interesting to see this sacrifice of remembrance that he's commanding them to. It's not immediately tied to their deliverance, but everything about it points back to the Passover. So the sacrifice of consecrating the firstborn back to God was giving his people another means of remembering what he'd done for them. For you and I on this day, when we think about a sacrifice of remembrance, I mean, we're not offering any sacrifices here. I don't think you'll ever see that in Dunbar Heights. We do offer sacrifices in other ways. There's a lot of ways that we do offer a sacrifice of remembrance. One I'm going to just offer for you to consider is your personal testimony. Testimony, your story of how God saved you. And the way that's a sacrifice, in some ways, it's about sacrificing your reputation. Sacrificing people's opinion of you. Because when we tell our salvation stories and how God saved us, we often want to focus on who God's made us to be. We very often don't like to talk about who we used to be. I mean, you think about, remember Aladdin, when Genie had transformed him into Prince Ali and he'd finally won the heart of Jasmine. He's terrified that she'll ever find out about the fact that he used to be this street rat. He's like, no, look who I am now. This is how we want to be in our own telling of our stories. And it's a sacrifice to tell the whole story of both who God's made us to be, but also who we used to be. But you think about those rags to riches stories. Maybe it's some punk kid on YouTube who gets a record deal and now is a famous music star, whatever it is. Every time you have a story like of that transformation, whatever it is, what do people always say to those people as they're driving away in their limo or whatever it is? What do they say to them? Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget where you came from. But I'll tell you, when we're willing to talk about where we came from, to sacrifice all the Facebook, Instagram pictures and perceptions that people have of us and say, no, this is what life is really like. Look at all that God saved me from. This is who I used to be. And actually, this is who He's still making me to be. This is who I'm not perfect yet. Look at all the ways I still fail. God is most glorified in that, seeing that process. He's not glorified in our perception, in our perfection. He's glorified when people see our weakness and what He can still accomplish through us. So two things happen when we do that. People are drawn to Christ. They see a real-life flesh and blood example of transformation right in front of them. But in that sacrifice, we're also reminded ourselves. We're drawn back to the story of how God saved us. So in offering that sacrifices, we're pointed back to what God saved us out of. One of the things I always want to say quickly about testimonies is also, please don't get fooled into that trap where we say, my testimony is so boring. It's not exciting like some people's. It's not this radical transformation like that guy. That's not true. That's not true. Yes, it is. Because according to the Bible, God has transformed us from people who used to be dead and now we're alive. People who used to be under God's wrath and now we're welcomed as His children. I don't know about you, that seems like a pretty radical transformation, right? So yes, maybe behaviorally, there hasn't been this radical transformation. If maybe God saved you at a very young age, I don't know. But your testimony should still cause you to remember, because listen, the fact remains, your redemption, whoever you are, still cost the death of a lamb to purchase. It still costs the death of a lamb to purchase. Quickly now, we've looked at a meal of remembrance, a sacrifice of remembrance. The final thing I want to show you is a community of remembrance. A community of remembrance, which is just a bunch of people around you that help you to remember. I don't know many of your stories. My own story of where I've come from in the past is I was born into a shantyman missionary family with two older siblings, where my mom tried to raise 3 young kids in a single-wide trailer with next to nothing, while my dad would travel around to logging camps and backwoods cabins, bringing church to people who had no means of getting there otherwise. I remember he would tell me these stories of people just weeping with joy as they were served the Lord's Supper for the first time in years, this meal of remembrance. The point is, we didn't have a lot to make it on in those days, and my parents said even missionaries used to send us boxes of clothes, which tells you what some of the outfits you see me dressed in some of those pictures. There'll be no pictures offered this morning. Later on, though, when we were older, our financial situation had improved somewhat, and whenever we'd be whining about something, what we were having for dinner, or where we were going on vacation that year, my parents would always sit us down and remind us of where we'd come from. Don't forget where you came from. Remember, look at God's faithfulness to us during those years. It was a community of remembrance that pointed us back to God's faithfulness to us. And I'll tell you what, that had a deep, lasting impact on me. Until I forgot again. Until I forgot again, like we all do. Look at verse 47 of chapter 12. Quickly here, we're going to see this. Remember, we're talking all about the way that this is supposed to be a meal of remembrance, and now there's a community of remembrance. Verses 11 of chapter 13 as well, they talk about how they're to celebrate these means of remembrance all together. It's something they do all together. And then they tell the story there of God's faithfulness in redeeming them out of slavery. They do this meal of remembrance, they do this sacrifice of remembrance, and then they explain to their kids how it happened, why this matters. Because remember, in one generation, there's not going to be a single child that knows what it's like to be raised in slavery. They're going to need to be told what happened. Maybe you don't think that's a big deal, but I'll tell you what, if you read just a little bit ahead to where they finally do make it into the promised land, and then Joshua, who's Moses' successor, he dies and that generation dies, the very next words after Joshua is buried are these: "And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work He had done for Israel." And then the very next words after that are, and the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's a massive ball dropped, right? So the next generation who does not know what you know, has not experienced what you have experienced, they need to be told. They need to be shown, and they need to be shown repeatedly and often. That's one purpose of the remembrance, this community of remembrance. The other is about welcoming people into that community, even as they are exclusive at it. Remember, we talked about how 43 to 50 is all about who's allowed to take the supper? Well, here, we're going to just see very quickly, God is saying through this that there are people who are allowed to have this meal of remembrance and there are people who aren't. Who are the people that are? They are those who have been marked with the sign of faith in God. Those who have shown that they have faith in God, those are the ones who can celebrate properly the remembrance of God's deliverance. So, he's saying through this, circumcision will be the sign. That's pointing back to Genesis 17, where God said, the mark of those who are mine, those who are included in my family, will be the circumcision. Now, maybe that seems unrealistically restrictive to most of us. I mean, if I were to have asked you last week if you'd like to come have Easter dinner at our house, but you need to be circumcised first, you probably would have politely refused that invitation, even if you have been. But if you think about what the point of circumcision is, the point of the meal of remembrance, it's suddenly not so unrealistic anymore, is it? Circumcision was a sign of faith and inclusion in the family of God, and the meal of remembrance was remembering what God did in redeeming them. Why would you want to celebrate a meal commemorating God's deliverance of you if you hadn't been delivered? That's like somebody with terminal cancer and hospice care asking to have their hospital bed pushed along in a cancer survivors rally. You haven't survived. It doesn't make sense for you to celebrate something that's not true of you. And as we think about today and the context we're living in, we're saying this meal of remembrance is the Lord's Supper. The community of remembrance that God has put for us is this church, is each other. This is the place where we spur one another on towards love and good deeds, like Hebrews 10 tells us. This is the place where we think about and remember what God did to free us, and where we teach future generations about what God did to free us. If you don't know, that's one of the reasons why when we take this supper each week, this meal of remembrance, I ask those who have not put their faith in Jesus not to take the supper. It's a meal of such importance, and it's signifying a deliverance that it's just out of integrity that we say, if you're not celebrating a deliverance, we ask you not to take it yourself. But remember, this isn't some sort of super secret club meal that we don't want other people to be a part of. If anything, all of this passage is about welcoming people to come and take it. We want people to be a part of this celebration. So we invite you to come to know Jesus yourself. We invite you to come to faith in Him so that you can celebrate along with us. Redeemed people, all in need of redemption, who have now experienced that redemption. In the end, the big idea is that God is giving His people these helps really so that they'll remember to remember. They're just going to remember to remember. You see how through the passage he talks about these helps would be like signs on their hand, symbols on their forehead. All that is just saying, these are things that you're going to see all the time. Just like a wedding ring, when I see that, it reminds me of my wedding day, of the vows I made. It's constantly pointing me back. Same thing. God's saying these things are going to be something that will constantly point you back to what it cost to redeem you. And I'll tell you what, maybe just thinking about that doesn't make sense to you. Well, how does just thinking about what God paid to redeem me matter? Well, let me give you some present-day examples of how that helps. First of all, when we're faced with oppression, opposition from people, remembering that Jesus' victory was over our greatest enemy helps us to not be overly fearful anymore in that situation. When we gather together or alone, remembering, pointing ourselves back to all that God's done for us, it leads us to worship. It leads us to worship Him and praise Him in our prayers, in our giving, in our singing. When we're feeling tempted towards sin, remembering reminds us what it cost God to free us, and it motivates us to then turn away from that thing. And when we have sinned, Remembering reminds us that Jesus' sacrifice for our sins was sufficient for all time. We are no longer under God's wrath, and we are still welcomed as his child. But I'll tell you what, for all the benefits and helps that remembering truly brings to us, do you know what remembering can't do? It didn't do for people in Israel, it doesn't do for us today. It doesn't save us. Remembering doesn't save us. Every other sacrifice that God commanded his people to perform accomplished something. It was redeeming someone back. It was atoning for sin. This sacrifice, as verse 3 told us in chapter 13, is solely commemorative. It's the whole point. I want you to keep it every year, but it's not going to continue to free you. When you sacrifice that lamb and clear the yeast out of your homes, you're not going to be released from Egypt again. It's all about pointing back. And the very same thing is true for us today. The author of Hebrews tells us this. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 11 to 14. Listen. Day after day, every priest stands to perform his religious duties. Again and again, offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when this high priest, which is Jesus, offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. Since that time now, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. So, the price of redemption has been paid. The price that was paid to redeem us has now been paid for all time. That's why we can't contribute anything. We can't add anything to our salvation. It's been completed. All we can do now is remember and keep that constantly in our minds. And as we do that, that's what allows us for all time to remember the cost and to remember now what that means for us going ahead. Remember what you've been freed from. Remember what you've been freed to. It's a lifelong process. And these memorials of remembrance are one of the things that helps us to constantly point back to that. Let me pray for us.